On the 16th of October 1978, the conclave of cardinals in the Sistine Chapel was about to break with 450 years of tradition. It was also about to elect to the papacy a man whom few, if any, of the crowd had ever heard of.
Habemus Papam. Eminentissimum ac reverendissimum Dominum Carolum, Sancte Romane Ecclesiae, Cardinalem Wojtyla.
The first question was, who is Karol Wojtyla? Within days, the attention of the world's media was on southern Poland, on the town of Wadowice, where Karol Wojtyla was born, on the house where he lived, on the school where he went to school, on the church where he went to church, on photographs of his parents, of Karol with his mother, and of Karol with his father. There was even confusion over two photographs of Karol at his first communion. Which is the real Wojtyla? Cardinal Wojtyla was about to emerge from that relative obscurity to become one of the world's most famous and influential men, Pope John Paul II.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, siamo ancora tutti addolorati dopo la morte dell'amatissimo Papa Giovanni Paolo I.
It is a very important moment, maybe said a very difficult moment for me. It was not so difficult, perhaps I admired, I was surprised that it was so easy to accept that, of course. In the spirit of a great hope, of a great confidence to our Lord and to his mother, to Our Lady. In this spirit, it was easier to find the serenity, of this moment, to not be disturbed. Anxious, of course, it's necessary to be anxious. To be anxious is also an aspect of having responsibility.
Wojtyła's mother died in childbirth when he was only 9. It was his elder brother, Edmund, who was the young Karol's closest companion.
Niewątpliwie dla Karola Edmund był protoplastą, był tym, który...
For Karol, Edmund, without any doubt, was a model. He was the one who showed him how to make use of his time so as to achieve as much as possible in life.
Ta rodzina miała niesamowitą prężność. To była ich ambicja, to była ich...
They were a family of extraordinary resilience. They had ambition, a powerful drive, an inner discipline and thirst for knowledge.
My wszyscy szliśmy na boisko.
I remember when we all went to the playing field, normally we would run about until we were exhausted. No moderation at all. And only when we couldn't run any more would we go home exhausted to study. But Karol was different from the rest of us. After about half an hour, more or less, when he felt that he was physically tired and had, as it were, charged up the batteries, and he was ready for mental exercise, he would say goodbye and go home to do what was to be done, that is, to study.
nas i szedł sobie do domu robić to, co należało, to znaczy uczyć się.
And so, when I came back from the playing fields later than him, I would go to him to copy out the Latin homework that he had already done.
Odpisać słówka łacińskie albo greckie, które on już miał gotowe.
Et benedictio Dei omnipotenti, Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos et maneat semper.
When Carol was 13, his brother Edmund, who by now was a young doctor, died in an epidemic of scarlet fever. Carol and his father were left alone. Not far from Wadowice is the Marian shrine Calvaria. The Virgin Mary is important to all Catholics, particularly to Poles, and even more, it seems, to Karol Wojtyla, who later chose to place the initial M on his episcopal coat of arms.
Karol Wojtyla was born only 14 kilometers from here. He used to come as a boy, he used to come as a priest, and then as a bishop. He came here as a pope. He said very remarkable words. He said that he used to come here and feel the great reservoir of prayer, from which he could draw for himself.
A few days after the conclave, the solemn inauguration ceremony. As the new pope accepts the allegiance of his cardinals, they might have reflected on the one quality Karol Wojtyla shared with the very first pope, St. Peter. He had never intended to be a priest in the first place. His first love was drama, not theology, as even the Archbishop of Krakow discovered on a visit to the school in Wadowice.
Mianowicie Karol w imieniu całego gimnazjum.
There was a very telling meeting between them. During Archbishop Sapieha's visit, Karol made a speech on behalf of the whole school. The speech must have greatly impressed the Archbishop of Krakow, because afterwards he turned to Dr. Zacher, our prefect, who later became the priest here, and said to him, "Where is that student going after finishing school?" As I said, we were still doing our exams.
Po skończeniu gimnazjum, mówię, byliśmy w trakcie pisania matury. Na to...
Well, the prefect said, "I am not yet sure, Your Excellency." Then Karol said, "With your permission, Excellency, I can explain."
Jeśli ekscelencja pozwoli, to ja...
So the Archbishop says, in his typical nervous but kindly way, "But please, please."
Nerwowe, ale bardzo dobrotliwe. No proszę, proszę.
And Karol told him that he was going to study philosophy. The Archbishop just turned away from him, saying, "Pity, pity."
No, szkoda, szkoda.
At the age of 18, Karol, with his father, moved to a house in the Debniki district of Krakow, there to study philosophy and literature at the Jagiellonian University. Almost immediately, he became involved in student drama, as actor, writer, and director. He was still planning a theatrical career. Instead, he became the youngest pontiff for more than a century, the first non-Italian to hold the office in 450 years, and the first Slavic pope in history.
May Christ give you his grace and his peace, overturning the barriers of division and making all things one in him.
The story of Wojtyła's election to the papacy starts at the death of Paul VI 2 months before. Paul VI, Papa Montini, had been a long time dying. There had been much consideration of candidates for the papacy. Popes are elected in total secrecy by the 100 or so cardinals beyond the locked doors of the Sistine Chapel. Despite the complex and secret arrangements, versions of the political scenarios do emerge. It seems that there were many within the conclave of cardinals who felt that Paul VI had already surrendered too much to modernity. Their preferred candidate was the 72-year-old Archbishop of Genoa, Giuseppe Siri, who had been the principal opponent to Montini in the conclave of 1963. Those who, despite Paul VI's death, wished to continue his work clustered around the figure of his previous Under-Secretary of State, Cardinal Benelli, a pragmatic liberal with experience of manipulating Vatican bureaucracy. Around him, it seems, a loose coalition of cardinals formed and selected a liberal candidate. Cardinal Wojtyła arrived at the conclave with no feeling that he himself might soon become a candidate.
Maybe dangerous to feel that. It's best to feel that in the moment when it comes. Maybe dangerous to feel that. Of course, before in the second part of the pontificate of Paul VI, on began to speak about different candidates, but not so much upon my person.
O tym, żeby był papieżem, do głowy mu nie przyszło.
When he was going to the conclave after the death of Paul VI, he had absolutely no thought that he would ever be elected Pope.
I wtedy mówię do niego,
I remember that after several days I said to him, "Listen, old man, have you brought a return ticket to Warsaw or just a single ticket from Warsaw to Rome?" He replied, "Of course I've brought a return ticket. Why shouldn't I have?" So I said, "Well, you talk so much about a priest's duty to live a simple life, not to spend money on luxuries, so why did you buy a return ticket to Warsaw?" He said, "What are you getting at? Are you trying to make an idiot out of me?" And I said, "What I'm getting at is that you are going to be elected Pope and the ticket will be wasted." "Oh, Mitek," said he, "get your head tested."
postukaj sobie w głowę.
The only form of communication between the cardinals in conclave and the crowd in St. Peter's is the colour of the smoke from burnt ballot papers emerging from the roof of the Sistine Chapel. Apparently, the Liberal coalition candidate had as many votes as Siri on the first ballot, but those cardinals not privy to the coalition's conversations soon ascended the Liberal bandwagon. No one expected an early result, so when grey smoke emerged, there was some confusion. Only white smoke indicates the election of a new pope. What colour was this? Only when the balcony doors opened did the world discover that the Liberal candidate, Albino Luciani, the Patriarch of Venice, had been chosen as the new Pope, John Paul I.
No i doszło do konklawy, odwieźliśmy go na konklawę, on wychodzi z konklawy.
And so, when it came to the conclave, we know that the smiling Pope was elected. I went to fetch Carol with a few priests.
Z paroma księżmi on tak wychodzi.
He was leaving last with Cardinal Wyszynski.
Z kardynałem Wyszyńskim.
He pointed his finger at me and said, "What have you got to say for yourself now?"
While John Paul I accepted the accolades of the crowd, the man who would be John Paul II returned to Krakow. Within a year of Karol starting his university studies, Hitler had attacked Poland and set in motion the Second World War. The Polish cavalry was no match for the German war machine, and within days, Poland had fallen. The Nazis began to dismantle the Polish state, and Polish patriots had to go underground. The young Karol Wojtyła tried to continue his studies and to set up a clandestine Polish National Theatre.
The Krakow Underground Theatre was started in this very apartment. It had already begun at the end of 1939, at the beginning of the German occupation. And the first one, because later on there were many theatrical groups, but probably the very first one was created by Karol Wojtyła, Tadeusz Kwiatkowski, Danuta Michalowska, and me.
Danuta Michalowska is now rector of the Theatrical Institute in Krakow.
Wtedy już zaczęliśmy się systematycznie spotykać właśnie tutaj i tutaj się odbywały.
We began to meet here regularly, and this is where practically all our rehearsals were held. This is where we had our long discussions about our artistic dreams. Well, perhaps they were not that long, as the curfew was in force, so we had to leave in time.
Ale właśnie w tym domu.
Well, Wojtyła was from the start of our acquaintance a man like the rest of us. I mean, very cheerful, very youthful. Physically, I would say, well built. Actually, Wojtyła distinguished himself among us by his acting talent, but above all by his voice, which he still has, hasn't he? A wonderful resonant voice, perfect diction. He was a great reciter, as well as a very talented actor.
Nasza praca od czasu do czasu owocowała jakąś.
This work of ours from time to time bore fruit in the shape of a so-called stage performance. This meant that friends and trusted people would be invited to a friendly apartment with a big living room, and they watched us perform.
I oglądały, słuchały nas. Oczywiście warunki były przecież.
Of course, it was all done in secret, under very difficult circumstances. We all worked, and worked very hard, too.
You see, during the war, everything was dangerous, and for Poles to be involved in theatre was dangerous on many counts. A man could go out into the streets during those days. In those conditions, he could never be certain whether he would return home again. On one occasion, in the early afternoon, about 30 people were supposed to come to a performance in this very room. And if you can imagine it, on the very same day at noon, the Gestapo arrived, because a man had been arrested in the flat next door. And they saw this room, which had clearly been prepared for some meeting or other. My mother received them. I was out at the time. There were 2 Gestapo men, and she told them that the chairs were arranged like that accidentally, because she was getting the house ready for a big house cleaning, which was just about to begin. And they left. But I would have to say that such incidents frequently used to end in the arrest of everyone who was present.
Karol Wojtyła, now 22, was still not ready for the priesthood.
What is essential for the priesthood is that the priest is acting in persona Christi, in the name of Christ himself. He is offering his own sacrifice. I didn't have this vocation, the awareness of my vocation after my maturity examination. That I have felt a little later. You know, it was the time of the war, of the terrible Nazist occupation in Poland. You know that this great suffering of the whole people, maybe that influenced also the direct examples of priests I met. I am very grateful to all of them who introduced me, humanly speaking.
Soon after his father's death, the young actor Wojtyła met a man who would change the course of his life, a blonde-haired mystic who trawled the streets of Krakow recruiting religious young men, Jan Turanowski. Among his recruits was also Mieczysław Maliński.
I was just leaving the St. Stanislav Kostka church at Debniki. I had just been to the Mass at 6 a.m. I was at the door, and I saw a man with blonde hair, all combed up, and a dark black coat reaching below his knees, and a hat. One could say very traditionally dressed. He was waiting, and quite clearly he was waiting for me. I was trying to pass him, although I was sure that he was waiting for me. He stopped me and said, "Do excuse me, I am waiting for you. I would like to have a word with you. I know you." Now, this was 1940. His every word was making me more and more nervous. I already knew what the Gestapo was and what they could do. So my first thought was, Gestapo. "May I accompany you," he says, "since you will be going home now to Madelinskiego Street." And how did he know that I live in Madelinskiego Street? Because, he says, I live in Rosanna Street, so we can walk together. I kept wondering, what does he want from me? "I have been watching you for some time," he said. Well, now everything was clear. If he tells me that he has been watching me, then everything is clear. I asked him, "What do you want?" "I would like to invite you," he said, in his characteristic high-pitched voice. It was almost a falsetto. "I would like to invite you." What did he want to invite me to do? No doubt to collaborate with the Gestapo. "I would like to invite you to join the Living Rosary." What? The Living Rosary? Oh, well, I could join the Living Rosary. I couldn't care less. I was only too happy that it wasn't what I had feared.
Malinsky and Wojtyla became part of a small group of students at Turanovsky's flat.
Turanovsky was an extraordinary man. He was a mystic, a man so profoundly religious that he was radiating God's message. I was put off by his combed-up blonde hair, his rather sentimental smiles, his falsetto voice, and all these lectures which sounded rather as if they came straight from the catechism, almost stereotyped. This is why Wojtyla kept telling me, look at what is inside him, not at the outward appearance. Turanovsky's influence on Wojtyla's life was gigantic. I can safely say that if it wasn't for him, neither Wojtyla nor I would have become priest. It would not have had any great consequence if I had not joined the priesthood. The church wouldn't collapse if I hadn't. But if Wojtyla hadn't become a priest, well...
Wojtyla kept his newfound enthusiasm to himself.
No ale oczywiście, że wybór został dokonany. Wybór zapadł.
Clearly, the choice had been made. The decision had been taken sometime in 1942. But Karol Wojtyla kept on working with us for another 18 months, until the end of 1943. We didn't know that he was studying theology. It was a secret course, and despite our friendship and close relationship, there was no reason why we should have known about it. But his flatmate, Kotlarczyk, most certainly must have known.
No oczywiście na pewno wiedział o tym Kotlarczyk. Tu w tym domu, gdzie mieszkali...
I imagine that in this house where he and the Kotlarczyks lived, there must have been many stormy discussions going well into the night. Kotlarczyk was a theatre fanatic. He believed that theatre was the most important thing in the world. He said one's duty to God and country could be best fulfilled through theatre.
Właśnie poprzez teatr.
The vocation is still a personal act and personal answer, personal response. And I felt that I cannot be other. I cannot realize myself and realize my mission in the life only as being priest. But first acting person in this in this process is of course the Holy Spirit and Christ through the Holy Spirit. A small theology priesthood I have proposed you.
In 1944, the uprising of partisans in Warsaw made the occupying forces in Krakow more than usually nervous. They began to round up intellectuals and potential troublemakers. Archbishop Sapieha, who had years before spotted Wojtyla at school, arranged for a group of student priests to continue their studies in the relative safety of the episcopal palace. In this room, 13 students ate, slept, and worked for the last 6 months of the war. Among them, Wojtyla and Malinsky.
The atmosphere we were working in was extraordinary. The Warsaw Uprising was still going on. We were aware of what was happening in Krakow, the constant manhunts, Auschwitz. All this gave a new meaning to our work. When I watched Wojtyla, the way he lived, his behavior, I wasn't surprised. I had already known him for several years, since 1940, so there were no surprises. But I could watch him at work. He studied very intensely. He didn't waste a single minute. Apart from that, he prayed a lot. He used to hide himself quite happily in the chapel. Another thing about him, he was the soul of our little circle. Even if someone else was chosen to lead some discussions, it was always Wojtyla who ended up being the leader. You could accuse me of saying all this because Wojtyla is the Holy Father now. But I don't. I can say that honestly as I can. I have no vested interest. I am not interested in becoming a bishop. That's the way it was.
It was this same palace that 30 years later, Wojtyla would occupy as archbishop and cardinal. And it was also here that he learned the news that finally put him on the road to Rome.
Well, he was having breakfast with a dozen or so priests at the table. He sat at the head of the table. Suddenly, Mr. Mucha, the driver, rushed into the kitchen and said, "Sister, sister, the Pope is dead." Sister Cook said, "I know the Pope is dead. Why are you telling me this? He died a month ago and we have a new one." No, it's the new one who is dead." "Really? Really? I heard it on the radio." "No, do tell Father Dziwisz." And Sister Cook, who was a pretty calm woman, said, "Well, I won't, but if you want, you can." And so Mr. Mucha had to go to the service hatch, which divides the kitchen from the dining room, and call out, Father Dziwisz came up and Mucha said, "The Pope is dead. I heard it on the radio." And when Father Dziwisz heard this, he turned away from the little window and said aloud to Cardinal Wojtyla, "Mr. Mucha has come, and he says that the Holy Father is dead." Cardinal Wojtyla was stirring his tea. He dropped the teaspoon, which hit the glass. And then he left the table without a word and went to the chapel. And there he prostrated himself on the floor, according to those who know what the cardinal does. So something was already in the air.
In Rome, the Vatican was in crisis. There were colorful rumors that the new pontiff had been murdered for a variety of imaginative reasons. What's more, the liberal cardinals realized that their victory in the conclave was short-lived. They would have to take on the conservative forces again. Giuseppe Siri was still available to stand for a third election. As the cardinals went into conclave for the second time in just over a month, several Italian candidates were being considered. Felici, the experienced Vatican bureaucrat. Colombo, the affable Archbishop of Milan. Bertoli, the well-traveled papal diplomat. Baggio, sophisticated and modern. But for the liberals, the most obvious candidate was the architect of the election of John Paul I, Benelli himself, provided he had not upset the sensibilities of too many cardinals by his obvious manipulation of the previous conclave. What had become clear to the Liberal coalition was that in the event of there being no suitable Italian to stand up to the Siri candidacy, they should consider a foreigner. But to break the Italian tradition, any foreigner they chose would have to combine some pretty impressive qualities. Karol Wojtyla finally started work as a priest at the age of 29 in the tiny village of Nigowice in southern Poland. The post-war communist authorities were, ironically, by virtue of their strident atheism, doing much to reinforce a clear and coherent Christian faith amongst a people who resented the new regime. Wojtyła's parishioners set about building a new church, which even now says as much about their political independence as it does about their faith. Within a year, the young priest was called back to Krakow to work in St. Florian's Church, but he also started an academic career as an assistant lecturer in philosophy at the university in Lublin. Any philosopher, still more so a priest, must consider the relationship between the individual and the state, particularly a state that claims to be atheist when its people proclaim the mother of Jesus as queen of their country.
Wojtyła's doctrine, if one can speak of that, has placed great emphasis on human rights from the very beginning. There is a great divide between the Catholicism, let's say, at the period between the two world wars and contemporary Catholicism. On the face of it, it is the same church, the same dogmas, the same prayers. But in fact, these are two different Catholicisms. Karol Wojtyła is one of those responsible for this division. The idea of human rights was present in the language of the pre-war church, but it didn't occupy such a prominent place as it does now. This particularly is Wojtyła's contribution. Wojtyła kept penetrating this question in its different aspects, but he was also translating it into practice.
Academic discussions continued outside the classroom in expeditions with his students to the Polish mountains.
I remember this, we were something like 6 persons on this excursion. I remember this as a constant, permanent discussion on philosophy. And he was trying to teach me the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. So we were walking around here, and with each step we were going deeper and deeper into the concept of a meeting between philosophy and religion and society also. We were arguing, and actually this arguing lasts until now.
I had an impression, I still have an impression, that there was enormous expenditure of energy, or one could even say a waste, spent on a bunch of young people. And I don't know whether everybody was really interested in what was saying.
Wojtyła taught philosophy, not theology. His students were not potential celibate priests, just young Polish men and women.
Christopher proposed us to go, proposed to a group of colleagues to go for bicycle excursion near Kraków, and he said that with him will be some priest. I was not very religious in this time, so I was a bit afraid. I went to this excursion because I liked very much Christopher in this time and now also. But so we met somewhere in Krakow, priest Wojtyla with bicycle, and we realized immediately that he is completely different as I could suppose. He was very natural.
What I remember the best, I think, when he was coming to our house, because you know we have 3 daughters, and when they were very small, we were arranging every year Christmas carol parties. And he was always coming for this Christmas carol party. He liked it very much because he had personal contact with all families. The children usually behaved very bad, you see, because they didn't treat him properly because he was playing with them. So they were sometimes going on his head and so on. But I think that he liked these things.
He was just one of us, so we treated him, or we felt him as a colleague, as a companion during excursions, with, however, a certain authority which he always had among us. We were always recognizing his need for being alone during some hours, thinking, contemplating. We had an unwritten agreement or unspoken agreement among us that this is the time one should not interrupt him.
I remember once he said, I was thinking, I was giving a deep thought to what we are doing together. Is it worthwhile? I mean, there are so many needs of the humanity and so many more important things than just a group of young people going to mountains or kayaking or meeting or discussing. And that he said, and finally I came to the conclusion, yes, it is important. Because what you are doing is setting up the model of the Christian people of 20th century, how they should live, people who are not priests, who are not directly connected with the church, but are the Christians anyway.
Trying to create model Christian communities on whatever scale was to become a hallmark of Wojtyła's ministry. Throughout the first day of the conclave, black smoke poured from the Sistine chimney as the cardinal's votes meandered from candidate to candidate, seeking inspiration. Outside, an optimistic crowd was hoping for another first-day result when, in the late afternoon, a burst of white smoke confused the watching world. Inside, it seems there'd been a surge of votes for Archbishop Colombo. He's reported to have announced that, even if elected, he would refuse the papacy. So the next day would see an attempt to find a foreigner who could appeal to the liberals, not frighten the conservatives, and have enough sense of his own destiny to accept the job.
I remember when he became bishop, I met him just after his nomination, and he said, look, I thought that my career will be theology, I will be a scholar. But it is so, as it is written in the Bible, when Christ said to St. Peter something like, somebody else will lead you where you will not want to go. So from these words I can think that he had some dreams what he wanted to be.
For Wojtyła, as a bishop, trying to build Christian communities inevitably meant entering the world of politics. In Poland, the Catholic Church and the Catholic press were almost the only institutions which could voice opposition to the communist state.
He was in fact never interested in politics. he relied upon other people to get busy with politics as far as the church was concerned. But he one day came to the conclusion that he must, after all, enter also these fields occasionally. But his point of view, in fact, remained non-political in a sense. I mean, he looked at it from another perspective, from above. Politics were subordinated to broader problems and horizons of morality or whatever.
At the town of Nova Huta, the atheist state had constructed their notion of a workers' paradise. Embarrassingly, the workers felt it might be improved by building a church. The authorities attempted to turn a deaf ear. Bishop Wojtyla lent his voice to the people and to their campaign, holding masses in the fields where their church might have been built.
Mówi się realizm. Realizm w myśleniu o rzeczywistości.
They say about realism that it is thinking about reality. In 1968, during the student riots in Warsaw, there was a banner, "Be a realist, demand the impossible." When I look back at the history of Wojtyła's life, which to a large extent is the history of my life, I think that here, in Poland, we've been anti-realists. If we'd been realists, then long ago we would have been, well, let's say we would not be ourselves today. True realism stems from demanding the impossible. And this is Wojtyła's greatness. By demanding the impossible, he was not just reshaping reality, he was building it anew.
The Nova Huta campaign was eventually successful, and work began on the building of the church. In 1962, Wojtyła went with the Polish bishops to the Second Vatican Council. His contributions greatly impressed the Roman Curia, and he returned to Poland, soon to be made Archbishop of Krakow and then a cardinal. As a young man, he had traveled extensively. Now, as Cardinal Archbishop, he used the newfound freedom of his status to continue his travels. Whether or not the conclave knew of it, it was certainly a clue to the style of papacy he might create were he to be elected. In Poland, he was already considered a winner, and as Cardinal Archbishop, he was naturally invited to consecrate the finally completed Nova Huta Church.
There is a Polish saying which says, well, you could steal horses with him, you see, and that was the feeling I had, that you could steal horses with Cardinal Wojtyła and realize some ideas we had here which were pretty difficult, perhaps.
While Wojtyła's success in fighting an oppressive regime would recommend him to the liberal cardinals in Rome, the methods and structures he used to achieve that success would appeal to the conservatives.
In the West, there is a very strong anti-institutional movement, which is also turned against the structure of the church. From our point of view, we need strong church structures. We need the church to be as strong as possible, in a structural sense, because then the church is better equipped to protect man.
His reputation as unshockable, while at the same time immovable, could also appeal to both sides.
He isn't just a dictator who declares, soldiers, these are your guns. He is a man who first listens and then tries to understand others. But of course he has his own principles, fundamental principles, and he has a vision.
But his vision of the church and its obligations to its own history was the clearest indication of the priorities of any papacy he would create.
There are different ideas about the church, even among Catholics. One is based on a very keen awareness that the church was established by Jesus Christ, God-man, that it has a certain spiritual reality, very profound, and that all we are saying here comes from Christ, or some of his interpretations, as embodied by the hierarchy, which has to guard this trust. Another idea of the church, in its extreme form, treats the church as a kind of Jesus of Nazareth religious association. That is a sort of democratic organization, which first chooses one chairman, then another chairman. And what the majority decides is sacred, isn't it?
In Poland, Wojtyla was a man of the people, an activist, and a democrat. But in Poland, where the alternative is atheistic communism, the people shared his vision of the church.
I think that the people in the technically very developed countries, I am speaking now about the Western countries in Western Europe and America, they suffer, if I may say so, from something which may be called the democracy paradigm. You see, democracy was such a success as a political system that the people in the West consider democracy as a criterion of truth, intellectual truth, but also moral truth, is something which is decided by voting.
At the end of the third day, Karol Wojtyla was elected Pope.
Habemus Papam!
It was the start of a pontificate that would change the face of the papacy. Some would say for better, some would say for worse.
When Pope Paul VI was dying, like many people, I played the game of the next Pope I want. And I knew exactly what I want, and we got him. I wanted an Italian, of sufficient integrity not to be corrupted by power, and of sufficient boringness and slight oddness not to become a major world media star. And he died after 3 weeks. And what we've now got is a man of enormous character, energy, personality, who is a natural media star. And therefore it's no fault of the popes, the present popes, that unfortunately he's now blown out of all proportion.